Key U.S. officials consulted with the financial firm BlackRock as markets went haywire at the start of the pandemic last year. According to the New York Times, the country's top economic officials, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, were in frequent contact with BlackRock Chief Executive Larry Fink, whose firm stood to benefit from emergency rescue programs.
Well, that report comes as millions of renters and vulnerable Americans are going through a housing crisis as a result of the pandemic and its economic repercussions. Last week, the Biden administration replaced a key housing official amid a flurry of changes aiming to overhaul the country's housing policy. Ryan, what do you think about this?
So it's interesting that BlackRock's main objective policy-wise is to make sure that it's not designated basically a too-big-to-fail company. Yet, as soon as we encounter some economic turbulence, you've got the Fed chairman and the Treasury Secretary on the phone consistently with the CEO of this company. If so, you can't have it both ways. You can't be systematically insignificant, but also be on the phone getting all of this information and engaging in all of this coordination with the kind of titans of Wall Street.
One really interesting thing happened when the BlackRock's current sort of influence over the housing market right now was rising to the top of the discourse. Ben Shapiro defended BlackRock as sort of a fair and legitimate economic actor in the system right now, and basically said change the system, and caught a lot of flack from conservatives, actually, which created this very interesting dynamic. Sort of people on the new right, maybe the Trump right, suggesting that's kind of too casual and dismissive of a libertarian argument against what's happening. What do you make of that? I mean, what do you think of the likelihood that conservatives are sort of coming around to the populist left when it comes to places like BlackRock?
Well, good for them, and I hope we get to a place where kind of Ben Shapiro's kind of simple-minded takes on this are rejected more often, because what he never does is take a step back or go a layer deeper and ask, well, okay. It's not like we all woke up and this was the system that the Lord created on like the third day. Like, this system was built, by Wall Street in a concerted fashion, from the 1970s up through today, and subsidizes the very type of activities that people are now complaining about. So you can't just say, oh boy, it's a real shame that we have this system that subsidizes this thing that we don't like, but that's just how the free market works. No. It doesn't have to work. And on top of that, there's also, interestingly, if we continue with the SALT deduction, homeowners have to pay their state and local taxes, and then they also have to pay their federal taxes because of the 2017 tax cut. But if you're a private equity company going in to buy a home, you can deduct all of your state and local taxes and interest as well off of the profits you make. And so then you're not only subsidizing the creation of the entire industry, you're then subsidizing them and competing with homeowners.
I was going to say, this is my primary point of opposition to that argument, which is of course there are always going to be excesses, even in a healthy system. There are always going to be excesses of the market and the free market if you have a system that rewards the free market. There are always going to be excesses. But to look at this particular instance, when you have heavily subsidized actors behaving badly, that seems like such an important quibble. I mean, it's beyond a quibble. It seems like such an important element of the story is that, can we really be saying, well, BlackRock's just a free market actor here. If you don't like it, change the system, when the system is also subsidizing them. And they're doing this sort of partially on the backs of subsidies, government subsidies, taxpayer money. Right.
And when he says something like, if you don't like it, change the system, he's not really serious. Like, he's not actually lobbying to
well, then the question
the
is, and I think this is what inspired conversation is, the question becomes, what kind of changes to that system would people on the right support? And I don't want to speak for Ben. I'm sure he probably does believe that crony capitalism is a deeply serious problem, but actually translating that into action from Republican politicians and Democratic politicians is the challenge. Right. And I don't know what appetite actually really exists to do that.
Right. And to me, the left should seize on this and say, and just make a blanket kind of moral statement about the kind of society we want. Home ownership is central to the American dream. If over the next 10, 20 years you allow private equity firms to buy up all of these residential homes, there's not going to be anything left for people to buy. And so you could just say, look, if you're a private equity firm, here either through tax or regulatory policy making, you can't own more than, say, 10 homes or whatever. Like we're just not going to, we don't want a society where Wall Street owns all the homes. We just don't want it, and therefore we're going to legislate that. And it's completely within constitutional authority to use tax policy to discourage or encourage particular housing policies. So they could just do it. And I'm curious if the right would be willing to go far enough and say, you know what, or does the right stop short and say, this isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's a shame.
Yeah, and that's, again, it gets to this question of like, if you believe fundamentally that markets create the best outcomes, that the freest markets create the best outcomes, then you can't really analyze this situation as one that is of a free market, because we don't know how BlackRock would be acting in a truly free market, because they're subsidized and because they exist in this completely cronyist universe. And of course, the real sort of conservative perspective on all of this would be to root out cronyism as energetically as you preserve the markets themselves, because it's a part of that. But it's an impossible task, really. I mean, I think Time Magazine said that there was the libertarian moment that was happening on the right in 2012. I don't call that libertarianism. That's just actually being a sort of responsible protector of the economy. But gosh, I don't think you really can translate that into momentum in Washington in a meaningful way at all.
And right, and if you allow these massive pools of capital to own all of these residential homes, it's only going to take a couple of housing crashes, and they're going to own everything. It really ticked up 2009, 2010, 2011, while we were seeing a foreclosure crisis, and you had all of this money on the sidelines that said, oh wow, that house in Phoenix that cost $500,000 2 years ago is now, I can buy it at an auction for $200,000. And they swooped in and they bought it up, and then they profited from the rise. Another housing crash, no doubt, whether it's next month or 3 years from now, and they'll come. We have a housing cycle now, and so next time it crashes, all these people get thrown out of their homes, and Wall Street buys up those, and you quickly get to a place where your only option then is to rent at whatever BlackRock will rent you at. Yeah,
and then you have to ask the question of how is this serving the common good? And that should be a question that people on the right, economically, not just culturally, keep at the front of their mind all of the time. And to act as though this is sort of a pure experiment in the market and market activity is ridiculous, because it's obviously, again, a heavily subsidized industry, and that's a key variable. You can't just sort of act like that variable doesn't exist. And so to say this is serving the common good ultimately because as the experiment plays out, prices will drop and it'll benefit people here and there. That's just not what happens when you have the cronyism involved in that. And then you have to say, well, how do we serve people best? And in this case, it's probably regulation.
Yeah, and one extra subsidy that they're currently getting is everybody knows they're too big to fail, so they would get a bailout if they crashed. But they're not designated as such, and if you get designated as such, you have higher capital requirements and some higher costs, which is why they try to avoid it. So by giving them the benefit of that designation without legally designating them that's an extra subsidy, and they're using that subsidy to for everything that they're doing.
That's a great point, and it's a good reminder of how regulation can even just involve non-regulation from a definitional standpoint. Right. So yeah, that's an important aspect too.
Yep, exactly. Team Rising is next. Stay with us.